Thank you all for coming. I promise I will do my best to speak slowly for the benefit of those of you who are Spanish speakers. But I often find it difficult. My motto I borrow from the futurist and scholar Marshall McLuhan: you don't like my ideas, I have others. And so I will give you a great many ideas to sort of start off the morning here. You're going to hear many practical presentations about the future of the office and of workspace and of organizations, and I would like to start by offering a bit of a more radical vision, potentially, about how to manage people in the city and in the office, not for productivity, not managing them by the number of people per square meter or vice versa, but really sort of looking at, where do ideas come from and how do we manage for things that we can't simply measure? How do we manage for serendipity? So I'd like to start, I guess, sort of a way to sort of introduce some of these ideas, but this gentleman, his name was Ronald Coase. He was an economist. He died recently at the age of 102. And like most economists, he did his best work when he was a very young man in his 20s. He published a paper in 1937 called The Nature of the Firm. He's really the only Nobel Prize-winning economist to this day to really ask the questions about why do companies exist? What size do they take? What shape do they take? Why are they even there at all? And Coase reaches simply three conclusions: why we have firms and why we have the office. These three things: search, negotiation, and monitoring. We need to find talented people who can do work. We need to then negotiate with them the price that they will do for this work. And then thirdly, we must monitor them. We must watch them as they do this work. And if you look at the costs of these three things, this will dictate the size of the firm. So, when costs are very high, you ended up with, as you did in the 1950s and 60s particularly, very large industrial firms, everything brought in-house, doing everything a corporation needs to do. But when those costs begin to fall, then you start seeing all sorts of different potentialities of a company. So size is a function of these transaction costs, as he called them. And so with the age of the internet, we've seen a steady falling in transaction costs. It becomes easier with these communication technologies to find people, negotiate, and monitor them. And in theory, if these costs were to fall to zero, we would have an entire world of freelancers, free agent nation, as we call it. And this is impossible. We'll never see the death of the company, but we have seen the sort of rise in the number of people who work beyond the traditional boundaries of the office. This is a US statistic looking that by 2020, we could have as many as 40% of the US workforce be made of freelancers, contingent employees, et cetera. And this has led to sort of new creations. So we've seen, for example, outsourcing. This is, of course, old hat, moving functions out of the firm and the office to the other side of the world, or the other side of the city. We've seen companies start to describe themselves as ecosystems. They see themselves as organisms, as part of a larger landscape where your partners and your collaborators and your customers and even your competitors are all part of this system that goes beyond the walls and boundaries of the company and the office. And more recently, we've seen the rise of crowdsourcing, which is where you see companies simply ask outsiders to solve their problems for them. You offer them a prize, or you offer them some sort of incentive to crack a nut where you haven't been able to. And these are all examples, and I think these are all interesting. What they all have in common is two characteristics. One is the notion of permeability. The traditional company was a box, and you are inside this company, and you're inside this office, and tasks and intellectual property don't go outside of it. People don't leave it. And the second part is this trade-off between size and scale. You see very, very large companies and very large functions, but they begin to lose the ability over time to grapple with reality on the ground, with granular tasks and work face-to-face. And so I would argue that, to borrow from another thinker here, that the traditional company looks a lot like this. I don't know if you can recognize what this is. This is a tree farm in Germany. This is millions of trees laid out in orderly rows. It's very easy to see, exactly how the health of that forest is doing, unless, of course, you get on the ground, in which you realize that tree farms are particularly prone to blight. They die by the tens of thousands when they catch a sickness or a predator. And then this is the opposite of that. This is a farm, if you can tell. This is a farm in Papua New Guinea. It's very difficult unless you are a local who runs this farm, because it's very localized. It's made of overlapping systems that nurture and irrigate each other. But the problem is that you can't tell what's actually happening in the system unless you grew up with it, unless you created it. I bring these up as an example of the office and its sort of antecedent because of a Yale anthropologist named James C. Scott, who wrote a very interesting book called Seeing Like a State. And he basically argued that the tree farm is a very legible system. You can look at it, you can understand it. Its inner workings are supposedly made available to you, but it's very brittle, it's very scalable. And then illegible systems, that second farm I showed you, are very resilient. They're very resistant to shock, but they're very difficult to distinguish. It's very hard unless you are very local to understand what's going on inside of them. And he used these terms to basically describe a number of things. So, the characteristics of legible and illegible is closed versus open. A legible system is very obvious, but it's very hard to bring in new input. An open, versus an illegible one, which is very open to new ideas. Companies versus cities. I think company in the office is the perfect example of a legible system. You have an organization chart. It's very easy to see how the company should function. And an office has a very organized layout. It's easy to walk into one and see where departments are working together. But of course, we know that the actual nature of work is very illegible. You don't necessarily work with your direct reports. Every office is a negotiation between people of different ranks and backgrounds, and this is how work actually gets done. And then, of course, there's also notions of this. I think the most relevant one is the notion of, a company and an office is united in purpose. You are doing tasks. You are united in this one thing. But it could be very difficult to innovate, to introduce new ideas, to introduce new culture into it. Versus, an illegible system like a city lacks purpose, but it's very easy to bring in new ideas. And so to me, the question that becomes is how do we make the office less legible, less like a tree farm, and make work less this way, and more like a city, more illegible? Because what happens is, and so James Scott in his book, he gave an example of a highly legible city, looks like Brasilia, of course, which, as we all know, is a failure 50 years after they built it. It was a failure almost from the moment they built it. But to me, what's more interesting is the most legible system of all that we work in is of course the office, and the notion of the skyscraper as an office repeated floor after floor after floor. Very brittle, very hard to get people into, and many times empty. We know from studies, for example, that peak utilization of the office is perhaps 30% or 50%. Most people aren't doing work in the office. Most people go elsewhere. And to me, this is a very interesting opportunity for us to rethink where work is done and how to manage for work. And of course, attempts to change the office have occasionally arisen. This was the Human Action Office by Robert Probst, which of course became the cubicle, and doomed us to this. I love the recognition of the cubicle and its endlessness. But I would argue that the workplace of the future and the dynamic system is in fact the city. And this is, to me, I am an urbanist at heart. I'm really interested in urban systems, and I'll talk more about what makes cities special. But this is sort of, the general purpose is that we know that cities are different. They're special. They're not organisms. They don't act like biological systems. And they're not machines either. They're not efficient and rational. There's something better. This is some work by a team of physicists in the US at the Santa Fe Institute. They're complexity scientists. So they graphed all these numbers and looked at cities as they grew bigger. And what they found is that cities actually get better as they grow bigger. So if you double the size of a city, you get twice as many plus extra number of patents per capita and wages and super creatives and innovation and all these things. They grafted out thousands upon thousands of data sets to achieve this sort of notion. So obviously cities are acting in some other way where once you start bringing all of these people together, something magical happens. And what they found that was really interesting is that, this graph on the left, this is what most biological organisms look like. They are born, they mature, they plateau, and they die. And this is true of humans, this is true of any organization we've created, including companies. Turns out every company dies except breweries. Beer will last a millennia. But cities on the right there are different. They continue to scale, and they are effectively immortal. We know the oldest cities in the world are 5,000, 10,000 years old, far beyond any company. And so, to me, the question is, what can we learn from cities, and how do we adapt this to the organization, and how do we use this to find new ideas and manage to discover things beyond what we already know? These physicists arrived at a new metaphor for thinking about what makes cities special, makes them different from companies. And that is something like the sun. They're what they call the social reactor. And this to me is interesting because this is the metaphor of social networks, really the sort of dominant metaphor of our time now. And the notion is that a city is essentially these dense and overlapping social networks that are brought closer and closer together in space and time until they essentially compress and fuse. They become like a star, essentially. And that is what makes them special. And this happens in cities and doesn't necessarily happen in companies where the social networks are closed. And you can see this even in some of the most unforgiving economic circumstances. This is from Dharavi, the massive slum in Mumbai. And it's interesting, there's an architecture firm there named Crit that came up with this notion of the blur. And to them, what makes cities special, even slums like Dharavi, and especially slums like Dharavi where you can see this, is this blurring of public and private space. You can pack more activities and more people into these places, more functions, more activities. And this is their argument about what makes cities special. A company is an office, is single use, not used all the time, not used by everyone, versus a city is, in fact, available to everyone, and you have this multiplicity of uses. And so it's this blur that leads to what they call the transactional capacities of the city. And so this leads me to, so where I think, I don't know if I have a laser pointer here, their argument, and I agree with this, is that the ideal city, the ideal form to which to do work, is not, here on the left where you have all the resources and none of the blur. That ends up with a traditional office, or you have an office tower, essentially. And then on the far right of this is what happens when you have all blur or no resources. You have a slum, neither of which is an optimal condition. The most fertile condition for coming up with ideas and for doing things is in the middle, where you have a cross between the blur and the transactional capacities. And it's interesting because their example of that is what they label old labor housing. This is what Jane Jacobs, who wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities and wrote The Economy of Cities, was describing when she talked about the fact that new ideas require old buildings. She was writing about Greenwich Village, which of course historically was a bit of a slum in New York City. I think it's very interesting that the most fertile places for these sorts of things are not gleaming glass skyscrapers, but older buildings with street life where people are able to mix and you're able to see these sort of crossings of that. And these are the conditions that lead to serendipity, that lead to the idea of discovering things that you weren't even looking for, where ideas are simply in the air and where people can meet and unite and create new forms of work. So serendipity, if you're aware of it, is a word that was coined. It was borrowed from Persian and repurposed by the British. It's a word that basically used to describe all sorts of things like penicillin, dynamite, Kevlar, all these inventions that were almost random luck. But they weren't luck, because the person who discovered them knew sort of what they were looking for and had the ability to find it. There were the right conditions for these sorts of discoveries. And this happens with people as well. Today, of course, we don't work as individual inventors. We work in teams. We have basic, huge cross-functional capabilities. And so we can see this true in the scale of, this is Harvard Medical School. And it shows you that some of these buildings, the way they're color-coded, produce more interesting papers than others, more influential research that lead to patents and creation. And so you can see that some of these spaces are more essentially serendipitous than others. This graphs the number of co-authors related together. And the paper showed that who you work with and how often you're likely to run into them in physical space matters more than your degrees, it matters more than your credentials, it matters more than your past work. The sheer ability to meet people face to face is one of the most key drivers of innovation. And we know this because we have attempted to design this for several decades. This is a slide of AT&T Bell Labs in the 1950s. Bell Labs, of course, gave us the transistor, the laser, worked on the satellite. They organized their scientists in ways so that you had different experts of different fields constantly overlapping and running into each other. And they tried to manage them by essentially leaving them to their own devices, which is what Facebook is trying to do today with their new headquarters in Silicon Valley. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, has asked Frank Gehry, one of the world's most famous architects, to essentially design one giant room that's something like half a kilometer long and a half a kilometer wide, where he can basically put 3,000 engineers into one space. What's interesting is he's not asking Frank Gehry to design an office for him. He's asking simply to create this room so he can put all of the desks on wheels so they can basically collide with each other in ways that Mark Zuckerberg can't foresee, and so teams can reform. And I find this interesting because this is sort of an admission of failure of workspace, is that Frank Gehry cannot design an office that reflects the reality of inventing new ideas and reacting as quickly as Google as they should. And so to me, what's interesting is, when you take these ideas to their logical extreme, Facebook's current headquarters, for example, is arranged like a city so that people will bump into each other. What happens when we start blurring the line between the office and the city? What happens when you go out into the city itself to do work from other people's offices, from public spaces, from the sidewalks? And we know this has been done traditionally too. This is not a new idea. The British in the 17th century created the coffee house, where for the first time commoners and noblemen could work together or could exchange ideas in the same place. And if you read the diary of Samuel Pepys, the young British civil servant, you know that he was a mobile worker before his time. He lived next door to his office, he traveled often, and he ended up his days in a pub or in a coffee shop like this, where he was exchanging information. So to me, I'm very interested in sort of the new urban forms that are going to emerge. We're going to extend the office into public space, where we can find new people, find people who are our peers, but not necessarily our coworkers. And so I have sort of two notions of this to tie back to my earlier comments. One is that serendipity is the mechanism where those social networks fuse, where all around us in this room right now are, of course, people you don't know, but you have perhaps common backgrounds with. Any one of us could change each other's lives if we were simply to meet and perhaps unlock the knowledge in our heads. And this process, I think, has produced so many great ideas, inventions, innovations, value, but we don't know. It's impossible for us to figure this out. So one challenge of the office going forward is how do you create spaces in which you can't really manage what's going to come out of them? How do you put the greatest number of people into the same space that can potentially unlock these ideas? And how do you do so in a way that doesn't completely wreck corporate culture and purpose? This is what I mean by overhead costs. I mean, perhaps the most productive way is to simply mill around the city all day, which is sort of what I did yesterday, sitting in cafes and enjoying myself. But I think one goal of the Office of the Future, and this is a graphic that the New York Times did for me, is imagining, can we create office space that pushes people together at the right time in the right place to unlock ideas? How do we bring people together that goes beyond their formal duties? And basically immerse yourself in places where you can discover new perspectives, new viewpoints, new companies. So here are a few examples. This is WeWork Labs in New York City. This is a co-working space, private offices. I'm sure you're very familiar with the form. But on their top floor, they invited an architect and a designer named Dror Brenstreet to basically curate his own ecosystem. So he took over this space and then he leased it out and recruited all the people he works with. So he designs everything from furniture to a private island off the coast of Abu Dhabi. And so he brought in people who are experienced as architects and renderers, laser cutters, all the potential backgrounds for his projects. And so that way he has them all in one room. But that way they also have each other, so they can work on different projects, consult each other for ideas, and work face-to-face in this collaborative setting. So all of them are essentially freelancers, but they're all freelancers in a united purpose. Another example, this is in San Francisco. This is the San Francisco Chronicle building, one of the newspapers there, which today is being modeled into what's called the 5M project. Eventually it will be a big piece of corporate real estate, 200,000 square meters. But for the moment, there's a co-working space called The Hub. There is a tech shop where there's all sorts of high-tech equipment where innovators can come in there and use it by the hour. There's an arts incubator. There's all these sort of spaces to encourage people from different backgrounds to use it. And their pitch, ultimately, to their corporate tenant, which at the moment is now Yahoo, has moved in there, is that you can work as closely with these people as you like. We've created this sort of fertile environment for you to meet people and meet ideas and acquire potential new companies. And then even more interesting to me, ultimately, this is a space in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is a city of about 1 million people. It has several large conservative companies. And they've created a shared office called Grid 70, where essentially the design and creative teams of these 6 companies, which include a shoemaker, a furniture maker, a grocery store chain, a health company, can all move their people together and learn from each other. So to me, it's interesting. Rather than work in your own home office next to someone who's in human resources or finance, when you're a creative, you can simply work next to other creatives and you can learn from each other faster. And this model is being adapted elsewhere. AT&T does this in Silicon Valley. They call it the Foundry, where they invite startups and pre-selected friends of the company to come in there and work alongside their engineers. And they've used this to find companies that, for example, reduce their call dropped quantity. So I'm actually able to use my iPhone now in New York again because it doesn't drop every 3 times. And in San Francisco, we've seen company Rackspace, which does cloud hosting. They've invited startups to work out of their offices as well, hoping to find this next potential acquisition or next potential idea to break through. So we're seeing these companies realize that not only at a conceptual level are you working alongside all these companies, but at a physical office level, you should be working alongside strangers as well. And the most interesting, outrageous example of this that's going on is happening in Las Vegas as we speak. This is the old downtown Las Vegas, which is now being transformed by this man, Tony Hsieh, into the Downtown Project. Hsieh is the founder of an online retailer, you may know it, Zappos, which sells shoes. And so he sold out to Amazon several years ago for $400 million, and is now using his money to essentially merge Zappos, the company, with the city. He's investing his private fortune in building a whole new downtown from scratch in the name of, as he will tell you, serendipitous collisions, because the more you collide with other people, the faster you learn, the faster you're and more productive you become. And so he's basically taken his, over 1,000 employees, soon to be 2,000 employees, and immersed them in this sort of environment of new startups, small businesses, schools, everything else. It will be very curious to see how well it works. He's created his own co-working startup. He's created his own transportation, bike sharing, car sharing scheme. All these things to attempt to accelerate the productivity of his employees. And so, the final piece of this is, that's the most audacious example. It'll be curious to see how it works. But on top of this, how are we going to find people in the city when we start leaving the office intentionally to discover new people? And how do we do a better job of discovering new people? I think technology has a role to play in this. I think there's going to be a very interesting convergence of the smartphone or the wearable technology, the social network, and GPS in the city itself. And so these are my ideas. So this is where mobility is headed. And we know that cities' killer app is serendipity. You can find people in them in ways you can't find in the office. So what happens when you start mapping the capability of the cell phone onto the city? I think you get what might be called serendipity as a service, just as we talk about software as a service. So of course, this is the original Manhattan street grid, very logical, very ordered, very legible. But now it's becoming, now there's a whole new layer of data added onto it, which is of course made possible by services like Foursquare. This is a map of my Foursquare check-ins over the last year and a half. You can see in the lower bottom there, I live in Brooklyn Heights and I work from Dumbo, and then of course, I travel across the city checking in various places. This data information layer is becoming more and more visible and more apparent. And then of course, we're adding sort of real-time capabilities. Foursquare simply shows you where I have been. The future is where I am right now and who you can connect me to. And of course, the first use of this is online dating, mobile dating. So this is OkCupid, where you can basically find strangers around you, and if they're cute, you can signal to them. The next iteration of that has happened, services called ambient awareness or social discovery, apps that map all the people around you, and then using analytics, can try to recommend you to other people, or at least tell you who's around. And so these are apps like Highlight and Sonar and Banjo that are attempting to do this. And these capabilities are becoming more powerful. This is a company I'm writing about that just started up in the United States called Relationship Science. They've built a proprietary social network of 2.5 million people, essentially the wealthiest 1% of US society, and then can map your relationships against anyone in their database. And their algorithms can show you here, red means there's a strong relationship to Stephen A. Schwartzman, one of the top financiers in the United States. And so this software can calculate in almost real time how you are connected to all of these people. And of course, we know that this capability exists. We know you can engineer serendipity because the National Security Agency already has. This is one of the leaked slides showing that they have been, of course, recording all of the information on the internet and building their own proprietary social networks to see how potential terrorists and everyone else is connected. So sooner or later, we're going to have the software in our own hands where we're going to be able to see the relationships of ourselves with everyone else potentially in this room. And then we're going to have the technology to not just have this on our cell phone, but on something like Google Glass or something like a wearable device, perhaps on our wristwatches. And so to me in the future, what will be interesting is you could walk through a room like this with your social network app plugged into your glass, and you could simply see facial recognition of who is here, how you know them, how you are connected, what you might have in common. And if this technology matures and proves useful enough, then it becomes very interesting where you know who's in the office. Perhaps you can use this technology to mine relationships in the office, but you can also use it in the city to find people you otherwise would never have seen on the street corner. And this is happening at the level of physical space as well. We are surrounded by buildings right now that have bits and pieces of empty space within them. The question is finding them, and the question is using them. So we're seeing a generation of startups like Liquid Space, which is essentially Airbnb for the office, to activate these spaces and basically rent them by the hour. You could use every office space available. The future vision of this, and I'll be done in just a moment here, pointing to this is Mega House. This is an art exhibit proposed by an architect named Hitoshi Abe, where he imagined that instead of living in one house, you joined a network which basically divided your house across the entire city. And so you could rent rooms throughout the city for whatever purpose you needed. And so you belong to this network of sharing, which I personally find fascinating, the notion that you could simply float across the city on a daily basis. It'll be interesting to see how this develops. This is something I'm working on right now with the architecture firm OMA and several collaborators to imagine what these spaces will look like. Will it be like Mega House, where every potential space is your office? But how you'll divide it. But it's interesting, that traditionally this is them using blue foam to imagine to assemble new buildings. Well, what happens if you could imagine inside of all these other buildings? What if we never built another skyscraper or another office? What if we simply used the office we have? This, I think, is the major research question going forward. What if the city and all of its spaces and all of its people was treated as a resource for all of us to use rather than something to be walled out by the office walls? So as a final metaphor I'll leave you after all these ideas is that traditionally we think of the office, or at least as it started, was as a machine for doing paperwork. It was a factory for sorting paper and sorting people. Today the workplace, I think, is more like a synapse. It's more, we're trying to create exposure points to as many people and ideas as we can to bring in these ideas into the organization. So therefore we can learn faster, react faster, think faster. So that becomes the question. Rather than thinking about how do we create the most efficient office space, how do we create the smartest office space, the one with the most number of synapses? So thank you very much.